In this video we're going to talk about procedures, and in order to give you an illustration of why procedures are so important, I've created a little application called Shipping Calculator. And so in this application we're not going to use our own custom procedures. Instead we're going to just write code the way that we know how to do it up to this point in our lesson series. So what I've got is a text box where the user will enter the weight of an item that needs to be shipped, how far it needs to be shipped, and then we'll calculate the tax and display the total in these labels on the right hand side of the form. Additionally, there will be three different buttons. One to calculate how much it would cost to ship this within the United States, how much it would cost to ship it within Great Britain, and how much to ship it within Canada. And we're just going to make up some formulas here in order to calculate. We'll just make some simple formulas to determine how much it would cost and what the tax would be, not knowing the real amounts for the purpose of our illustration. This will work just fine. The first thing that I've done was created some constants within my application for the tax amount for each of the countries and define the percentages that it would cost to ship in each country. And then also the Canadian shipping will have a service charge of $12.95, and so we'll use that constant whenever we get into the BTN Canada click event. So let's look what else we have here. We have a form load sub procedure. See, we've already been working with procedures to some extent whenever we worked with events, but now we're going to create our own later on in this video. Then we have the BTN US underscore click sub, the BTN Great Britain underscore click sub, and the BTN Canada underscore click sub procedure. And so now what I'm going to do is just copy some code that I've already written and paste it in to our US button click event. I've dimmed 5 variables for the weight, the distance, the subtotal, tax, and the total. The first thing I do in the code is to convert what the user types into the txt weight text box into a double data type. And I do the same thing with distance so that we can use these in numerical format to perform calculations. If we just left them in their text format, this might not work exactly the way that we had intended. So here, in order to calculate the cost, we've just simply multiplied weight times distance. And this gives us the subtotal of what it would cost to ship. Then we need to add in the tax amount, which is the next line of code. Tax equals, and then our constant, US underscore tax underscore amount, times the subtotal. Then we get the total by adding together the subtotal and the tax. And then finally we display both tax and total in the appropriate labels on the form. So let's run our application and see how it works. I'm just going to type in a weight of 9 and a distance of 8 and click the Calculate US button, and notice that I get my tax and my total. Also, the Great Britain and Canada buttons don't work yet. And so let's go ahead and add some code behind them. What I'm going to do is select all of this code that I have here by holding down the Shift button and using my down arrow key on my keyboard to select it all. And now I'm going to use Edit, Copy, and then I'm going to scroll down to the Great Britain click event, put my cursor between the beginning and the ending of the sub procedure, and then click Paste. I'm going to do the exact same thing, put my mouse cursor in between the beginning and the end of the sub BTN Canada underscore click, and select Paste again. Alternately, I could have just used the keyboard shortcut CTRL and the V button at the same time in order to paste, and CTRL-C in order to copy. Now that I have the code pasted into each of the Great Britain and Canada button click events, what I want to do is change it up. For example, I don't want to use the tax amount from the US. I want to use the Great Britain tax amount. Additionally, what I want to do here in the Canadian click event is change it to the Canadian tax amount. Plus, I want to add into the total the surcharge. So let's go up to the very top of our code and copy this. I'm going to use my keyboard, Control C, to copy what I have highlighted. And I'm going to set my mouse cursor on this line and then hit Control V on my keyboard so that it pastes it in. So now I've changed around the formulas quite dramatically. Now I'm going to click Run. And so we'll type in 8 and 9, calculate in the US, calculate Great Britain, the number is different, it's a little bit higher, and calculate Canada quite a bit higher. Now what if my requirements change for my shipping? What if I need to change the way that the subtotal is calculated? Maybe I need to charge only half of this amount, so I'll multiply this by 0.5. Notice that I'm going to have to go to each of my click events, find the correct line of code, and change it appropriately. This is how bugs can sometimes get introduced into an application, because you may forget all the places where the code needs to be changed where you use this calculation. So this is the first problem with taking this approach, that I had to change code in 3 different spots. That should be a red flag in your mind that you probably didn't write your code modularly enough. So now let's go ahead and make one more change. What if now I want to add another label that shows the subtotal? So I'll have to bring my label down, place it, let's say, just here. Let's change some of the properties of it. Now notice what I have to do. I'm going to have to add that here, LBL subtotal dot text equals format subtotal currency, and I'm using this format statement, format, passing in the subtotal variable and passing in the word currency in order to make it look like currency or dollars. Now I'm going to have to do the same thing here. And the same thing here. So I had to remember to make this change in 3 different places, or else my application wouldn't work correctly. Now I'm going to run it and test it. And it seems to work just fine. But what disturbs me about this is that this was just a very simple application, and yet when I needed to make changes, it was pretty involved. I had to make changes in each of 3 different locations. Isn't there a better way to do this? And the answer is obviously yes. If we were to employ procedures and functions, this would become a lot easier. So what I'm going to do is just cut out all the code that we have here, get rid of it all, and start over. We're going to leave the constants where they're at. And so the first thing that I want to do is create a function that calculates the subtotal for me. You might be saying to yourself, wow, that was quite a bit of typing, and that's true. So let's take a look at each of the parts of what I just typed in. First of all, I declared this as a function. A function is used whenever you need to return a value that you've calculated, or through your business rules you need to return. It could be an object, it can be anything. In this case, our function is going to return a double, as we've declared on the very end. So at the end of this function, calculate subtotal, we'll have a value returned to us that will be in the form of a double. Additionally, you see there's some values here that are separated by a comma in parentheses. Bival weight is double, bival distance is double. Let's not talk about the bival for now. We'll worry about that at some other point in time. Just take it at face value that you need to use bival whenever you're dealing with parameters. Parameters are values that you pass into your function. So whenever we call our function, like we'll do in just a moment, we're going to pass in the value weight and we're going to pass in the value distance. Now we can name these whatever we want to. There is a naming convention that we should follow, but I want you to understand first what their purpose is. So what I'm going to do in this function is pretty simple. I'm going to return weight times distance. Now this is a very simple function. It only has one line of code in it. Your calculate subtotal might be dozens or hundreds of lines of code, depending on the complexity of the business rules for your application. Let's now create another procedure, and this time we're going to create a sub display result Notice this time that we've created a sub-procedure instead of a function. The difference between a sub-procedure and a function is that a function will return a value while a sub-procedure will not. It'll merely perform an operation and then quietly finish. So here, all we need to do is display the result. So in this case, all we have is LBL subtotal.text equals subtotal to string. Now let's use both our function and our subfunction in our application. In the BTN US, what I'll do is this. I'll dim weight as double. I'll dim the distance as a double. And then I'll also dim subtotal as double. This is going to look very familiar to what we did before. And now what we'll do to retrieve the subtotal is we'll call our function calculate subtotal. So here we go. Our subtotal equals calculate subtotal. We'll pass in the weight and we'll pass in the distance. And then we'll call display result and we'll pass in subtotal. Now let's go ahead and run our application. And it seems to work. 8 times 9 is 72. Now you might be saying to yourself, okay, I'm not really sold on this, because you just really created a lot more complexity in the application by adding these functions than it would have had I just wrote everything behind the button. Well, that might be the case in this very simple application that we've built. But even as we go on and complete this sample application, you're going to start to see some of the benefits. And whenever you build very large applications, you will definitely need to use functions. And I'll demonstrate why that is near the end of this video. Let's go ahead and add in another function called calculate tax. And I just pasted this in here. Function calculate tax, we pass in the percentage and the tax amount. It will return a double. So we return the result of tax percentage times tax amount. So in our example here, let's go ahead and dim tax as double. Tax equals calculate tax. We'll pass in the tax percentage, U.S. tax amount, and then subtotal. Now let's also change our display result procedure so that it will display the tax amount. There we go. Okay? So let's see where we went wrong here. Notice when we changed our function that we didn't change where we called it at in our code. Let's go ahead and stop our application. And so we'll put in tax, and now it should work. Great. Okay, so let's take a quick second here to talk about how we actually called or used the functions that we built and the procedure that we built. To use a function, we will use the name of the function, pass in any arguments for that function, and then we can retrieve the value from the function and place it into a variable in this case. I could merely do this. What's the difference? Well, basically, I omitted the subtotal equal part. So in this case, it doesn't return anything, or it tries to return something, but we don't have a variable that will actually hold the value that's returned. And that brings us to one of our best practices. You should always capture the return value even if you don't need it. So say, for example, that you have a function that somebody else created and it does 90% of what you need it to do, but it also returns values that you're not interested in. You should still go ahead and retrieve the value like we've done in this line of code. This line of code here. And just ignore the value from that point on. Now in our case, we needed the value from our subtotal, and we actually used it then to display the result on the screen. So that's how you would call a function. In order to call a subprocedure, you can do something similar. We have the call display result, or we could just do display result subtotal tax. These two lines would do the exact same thing, and since they don't return any values, you don't really have the same issue as we just discussed a moment ago. But it's still considered good programming form to use the call statement whenever you are calling sub-procedures. And so that leads us to our second best practice, and that is to use the call statement when calling sub-procedures. And why would you do that? It just makes it very obvious to people who might look at your code in the future that display result is a sub. Now I'm going to take a moment to go ahead and finish the rest of this example, but I'm going to pause the recording so you don't have to watch me type. Okay, I'm back, and I've done quite a bit of work. Notice how few lines of code now I have in the BTN US click, BTN GB click, and the BTN CA click. I could even reduce this down further, but I decided not to. Basically, let's take a look at what's common across all three of our button click events and then go on from there. We grab off the weight and distance like we did just a moment ago in our previous example. And now what I've done was I called a single function, or subprocedure actually, called calculate amount, which I've already violated my first rule here, haven't I? I should use the call statement. And I'll do that right now, fix that, just to impress you with how important it is to me. I took a timeout to actually add that to what we're looking at here, but call calculate amount, pass in the weight, the distance, and the tax amount. And the same thing is true here. Calculate amount, weight, distance, and the Great Britain tax amount. And here in Canada, I have call calculate amount, weight, distance, tax amount, and I also pass in an additional parameter called the service charge. So let's take a look at this calculate amount and see what it does. You'll notice that the bulk of its functionality is determining the subtotal, tax, and the total amounts, and then finally calling the display result. So it's very similar to the code that we had in all three buttons in the previous example. I just took all that code and I consolidated it in one place. If you find yourself writing the same code more than once, you might think to yourself, there's an opportunity here to pull that common code out and put it in a single spot. And so that's what I've identified, and that's what I did. And so now these in turn call the other procedures that I've created: the calculate subtotal, the calculate tax, and the display result subprocedure. And so these have remained basically the same. In the display result, I did now add the displaying of the total, and I believe I already had the tax and subtotal from the previous example. So now, let's say, for example, I need to make a change to how the application works. Let's go ahead and look at it, make sure it works, just to show you there's nothing up my sleeve here. So let's type in 8 and 9, calculate US, Great Britain, and Canada. It all seems to work just fine. Now, let's do this. Let's, from the previous example, change how the subtotal is calculated. I only need to change it in one spot. Now, instead of changing 3 different lines of code or more in 3 different spots or more, all I had to do was change one line of code, and it worked fine. Let's go ahead and run it now. Previously, this brought up a subtotal of 72. Now it should bring up 36, and it does for the subtotal. Additionally, what I did was in the calculate amount subprocedure, I added an optional parameter. Now, an optional parameter means that you don't have to supply it. So in this case, the very last parameter after the weight, distance, and tax percentage, I specified optional parameter by val service charge as double, and then you have to default it to some value, in which case I defaulted it to the value 0. So this means in the US and Great Britain, I don't have to supply this value. But where applicable, for example in Canada, I was able to add that value into my call to the calculate amount subprocedure. Now you might say to yourself, well, how in the world did you decide what should go where? I mean, how did you decide to break this out into its own function that in turn calls these other functions? And that's a good question. That really comes with more experience. As a general rule of thumb, each procedure should only do one thing. You should be able to use one sentence to describe what a procedure does. If you ever have to use the word and, that might be the first tip-off that you are doing something incorrectly. Like, for example, if, for example, I have this calculate subtotal, I could say the calculate subtotal function returns the subtotal of the values to be shipped. If I were to say this, the calculate subtotal function returns the value of the items to be shipped and the tax, I might say to myself, well, and the tax, well, maybe I should break that out into its own function. And as I've already indicated, if you find yourself typing the same lines of code over and over and over, you might think to yourself, this is an opportunity for me to break that out, take that code, and put it into a single spot so that if I need to make changes to it, I just need to make changes in one place. If you need some of the concepts reinforced, I really would encourage you to read the lesson material that I've supplied for lesson number 9.